In this lecture, we will cover organic molecules. First of all, we need to know the parts of organic molecules. The organic molecules that we're going to discuss are all composed of monomers that are then formed into polymers. So, organic compounds, the compounds we're getting ready to talk about, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. We refer to them as organic compounds because they contain carbon-hydrogen bonds, at least one. Okay. The monomers that we just mentioned are single subunits, and we attach these through chemical bonding, and we do it over and over and over again to form polymers. So in our image, you can see our monomer, our one little circle. Okay. This is our chemical formula if we want to get real fancy. Okay. And you'll notice that if we just start connecting these, CH2 after CH2, we have now formed a polymer instead. Okay. We do this through a process called dehydration synthesis. Okay. We add molecules together by removing water. And if we would like to break down a polymer, okay, this larger molecule, back into its original subunits, so if we want to go from a polymer back into a monomer, we would use hydrolysis reactions. Okay, that's a catabolic reaction that uses water to break down polymers. So our first organic molecule is carbohydrates. Most people are familiar with carbohydrates from the foods that we eat, pastas, breads, things like that. The primary function of carbohydrates is to fuel our body. Some carbohydrates also have a structural role that is more for plants and other types of organisms and less for humans. Our monomers are known as monosaccharides. Okay, mono meaning one or single. Okay. Saccharide means sugar. Okay, so these are individual sugar units. Okay. And this is what all of your carbohydrates are made of, which is why they're so tasty. They're made of small sugars. Just a few examples of monosaccharides. We've got glucose, which gets talked about a lot in A&P. We also have fructose. That might be familiar to you if you like to eat a lot of fruit. Galactose, ribose, deoxyribose. We have several examples. Now, if we stick two monosaccharides together, we form a disaccharide. Some of these are also familiar to us. The most common one for us is sucrose, which is just table sugar. So the sugar that you buy from the grocery store and put in your sweet tea, that's sucrose. Now, if we continue attaching monosaccharides together, we form polysaccharides. Okay. The ones that are most favorable to us are glycogen, okay, starch, and cellulose. So let's talk about what those do. Okay. So glycogen is the most useful to us because this is one of the ways that we store energy in our body. So your liver, bless your liver does all kinds of stuff. One of the things that your liver does is it takes excess glucose from your diet and it turns it into glycogen, which is just an energy storage molecule. If we happen to have to skip lunch for whatever reason, we would like to not starve to death. That would be awful. So your liver can take that stored glycogen and it can break that down back into the glucose, and then we can use that glucose to get us by until we can have a meal. Now, cellulose and starch, we bring these up. They are found in plants, but we bring these up because we eat a lot of plants. So cellulose is used for structure in plants. So if you think of a tree or a plant or a flower, they have a shape, they have a structure. Many of these can grow quite large, but they don't have bones like we do. So something has to be giving them structure. That's one of the functions of cellulose. Now, they also contain starch, which is an energy storage specifically in plants. We have actually heard this word, Okay, we use this a lot in society. This is the same starch that you find in many foods like potatoes. Okay, so why is that potato full of starch? Well, it's not just to make it delicious, so we will eat them all, although that is a good reason for us. That plant, that potato, is storing all that starch because it would like to use that energy later. Our next molecule are lipids. It's a whole category technically. We have lots of different types of lipids. These are nonpolar. They are hydrophobic. They are mostly composed of carbon and hydrogen bonds. Okay, we call them hydrocarbon chains. These are also good for storing energy, and they help us insulate ourselves. Okay, so your lipids. Okay, the main component we just said was carbon-hydrogen bonds. We call them hydrocarbon tails. Okay. If your hydrocarbon tail has approximately between 4 and 20 carbon atoms, we call these fatty acids. Okay, these are your lipid monomers, these fatty acids. You may have one or more double bonds within that hydrocarbon chain tail. They look like little tails. So we've got our little head and we've got our little tails. Okay, each fatty acid has its little head and its little tail. Okay, sometimes we have double bonds, sometimes not. If we do not have a double bond, these are referred to as saturated fats. You will notice in our image that these chains, these hydrocarbon tails, are just very straight. Okay, if we do have one or more bonds, double bonds specifically, we will have a little kink where that double bond occurs. You will notice that this causes our hydrocarbon tail to bend. So these put off quite a different shape. Okay. Now, you are familiar with saturated and unsaturated fats, and you may not have even known. Saturated fats are things like butter and Crisco and anything that is solid at room temperature. So because these saturated fats have these nice straight tails, they can pack very, very closely together, which is how you make a solid. Okay. Unsaturated fats are things like vegetable oil, avocado oil, extra virgin olive oil, all of your oils. Okay, anything that is liquid at room temperature is an unsaturated fat. These kinks that are caused by these double bonds, okay, especially this guy. Ooh, look at this guy. Okay, these cannot pack closely together like the saturated fats. Okay, which is literally how you get a liquid versus a solid versus a gas. The closer the molecules are to each other, the more likely they are to be solid. Okay, if they're spread a little farther apart, you've got a liquid. If they're very, very far apart, you've got a gas. Okay, so saturated are solids at room temperature. Unsaturated are liquid at room temperature. Now, we do have a couple specific types of lipids we want to cover just because these are used so frequently in our body, and not just as a fuel source. Our body uses lipids for particular purposes. So first of all, we do have triglycerides. We've got our picture up here. We've got our glycerol head, which is kind of what this guy looks like. And we have our 3 carbon tails. Okay, your what's the word? Hydrocarbon tails. Couldn't think of the word, y'all. 3 hydrocarbon tails. So 3 tails, triglyceride. Okay. Now, why do we care about triglycerides? This is our common way to store a lot of the fats that we have in our bodies. And if you perhaps tend to overindulge in a poor diet, your doctor might fuss at you for your high triglyceride levels in your blood. No judgments from me. Now, there is another fat, or another lipid I should say, that we use quite often in our bodies. These are phospholipids. Okay? So now we have a nice phosphate group thrown in here at the glycerol head. We've got an extra little component here. Now we only have 2 little tails, or little hydrocarbon tails, but here's why we care about phospholipids. Okay. You have a lot of these in your body because we use phospholipids to create plasma membranes of your cells. Okay. You've got hundreds and thousands and millions and billions and maybe even some trillions of phospholipids because you have so many of them that go into making up just one of your cells. And think about it, you have trillions of cells in your body. Okay, so just kind of think about how many of these little guys you have. And I like to call them little jellyfish. They've got their little head and they've got their little tails. I think they kind of look like little jellyfish. Now, one of the reasons that these are so useful to us is because the little head, little phosphate head, has one property. It is hydrophilic. Okay, so it loves water. The little hydrophobic tails, however, I gave it away. These little tails are hydrophobic. They do not like water. Okay, so when you have a molecule that has two different properties, okay, so this one molecule, part of it's hydrophilic, part of it's hydrophobic. We have a fancy science word for that. We call it amphiphilic. Okay. This again is useful to us because our cell membranes are phospholipid bilayers. Okay, so we have two parts to the layer. We have a row of these phospholipids that would stand just like this. Tail up here, head up here, tail below. That next layer would be upside down. We have our tails, and then we would have our head. Okay? Now, this is useful to us because if, for example, this is our top layer on the outside of our cell, okay, our extracellular fluid contains a lot of water. Well, coincidentally, our hydrophilic heads are okay with that. If we pictured our second layer, our head would also be down here. Our intracellular fluid would also be full of water. And again, those hydrophilic heads are okay with that. But if we imagine this whole area in the middle with those hydrophobic tails, guess what's not found in there? That's right, there's no water in this area. Okay, so this plasma membrane helps us divide the extracellular from the intracellular fluids. Now, our next lipid that we are grateful for, you have steroids. Okay, these are all nonpolar. They have large hydrocarbon ringed structures. Okay, so these aren't the tails that we have been talking about. So this is cholesterol. Okay, this is kind of where everything starts. You will notice that we have 4 rings here. This is how we describe these shapes. And your steroids, your steroid hormones specifically, that's what we're talking about. Everything starts with cholesterol. Okay, so we take cholesterol and we fiddle with it and we add pieces and we kind of change pieces here and there. And we start to make things that we've heard of, like testosterone. Okay, you may have heard of cortisol or cortisone, aldosterone, okay, estradiol, which turns into estrogen, okay, progesterone. Several of these, you may have at least heard of them. You may not have ever heard of, let me see, deoxyhydrocorticosterone or something. You might not have heard of that, okay? And clearly, I'm great at saying it, but okay, I can promise you at least that aldosterone is super important in your body. So ultimately, what are we grateful for? We're grateful for cholesterol. Okay? Cholesterol tends to get a bad rap, gets bad reputation from a society standpoint. We're always worried about high cholesterol, things like that, which is something to be concerned about, but people tend to think all cholesterol is bad, and that's not true. Okay, you actually need a little bit because we need all of these hormones. All right, now, last but not least, we have eicosanoids. These come in different varieties. We have leukotrienes, prostaglandins. These are all involved in your immune response. If you have watched any allergy commercials, sometimes you will hear these terms, leukotrienes and prostaglandins. These are some of the immune substances that cause some of your allergic reaction symptoms that some of those allergy medications are trying to help us alleviate.